Right, Myra, do you want to kick us off in a moment then? I think it's 3 p.m.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Joy. So friends, welcome to this first event in the autumn programme of the Mint House. My name is Myra Blythe. I'm a trustee of the Mint House, and it's my pleasure to play timekeeper in this session. We have a very, very rich session with 3 contributors, and they're all committing themselves to a fairly strict and intensive timetable. Before we start, however, let me just make 1 or 2 announcements for the sake of the wider network. Firstly, let me say that this event, as so many events with the Mint House, is completely free of charge, but we do invite you to go on the website, and if you like, as they say, pay as you feel. So if you feel good, you might like to give £1 or 2 or even 5, but relax, it is free and you're very welcome as you are. There are many notices on the website of our autumn programme, but I encourage you to look there because you will find another event that follows on from this one next month, both of which are focusing on the topic of sexual harm. This is because we had a session in May where Estelle Zinstag gave a presentation on sexual violence, some reflections, where she was drawing very heavily on both academic research and theory to look at the issues that are specific to restorative justice in cases of sexual harm. And there was such a flurry of response in response to Estelle that a number of people have agreed to do follow-up seminars. This is the first one, and Vince Mercer next month, a second, both of whom are focusing on the practice implications of all the research and the theory that has been evolving around this still contentious area of restorative justice in cases of sexual harm. So look on the website and you will get notice of that. We have other events, training opportunities, as well as talks on restorative prisons and restorative practice in the climate crisis. And just newly online, we have an arrangement for Professor Mark Umbright to give a session on restorative justice and spirituality, where he'll be looking at mindfulness, deep listening and stories, the spiritual, not religious core of restorative justice. I think that's a theme that will be something new into our UK environment, and hope you'll have a chance in November to click in on that event. Now, finally, we're not able to keep people's email addresses due to the GDPR, UK data protection legislation. So if you would like to stay up to date, and Joy keeps everybody up to date every week with an enormous amount of information, if you would like to stay up to date on all our events and on other issues, please email joy@minthouseoxford.co.uk and she will add you to our email list, and you are more than welcome to receive all we have to share. Enough of that, let's turn now to today's programme, when we are going to be facilitated by a team who are very much representative of the Thames Valley Restorative Justice Practice. The title, Complexities of Restorative Justice in Cases of Sexual Harm, Learning from Practice and Research in the Thames Valley. So leading our discussions is Andrew Bates, a registered forensic psychologist and employed within the Probation Service UK. Alongside Andrew, we have Helen Lainey, the Senior Restorative Justice Practitioner in Thames Valley Restorative Justice Service. And finally, we have Dr Diana Batchelor, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the University of Oxford. And she will be speaking on theory, practice and research, which draws on very recent evidence she has gathered of the experiences of restorative justice in cases of sexual harm in the Thames Valley. So it's a very regional focus with a lot of direct professional input that is firsthand. So I turn now to Andrew, who has the ominous first task of giving us in 10 minutes an overview of 10 key issues, not difficult to calculate, 1 issue per minute, 10 key issues that arise in the practice of restorative justice in cases of sexual harm. the clock is ticking. Andrew, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Myra. Yeah, the clock is indeed ticking, even as I speak. Well, I probably won't be able to get through all 10 of my issues realistically, but I think some of the issues will also emerge in the discussions that we'll be having later on today. So don't panic if I don't get through all of my 10. I'm going to try and share my screen now because I have got a little PowerPoint. I hope everyone can see that. I'll assume the answer is yes, unless I hear otherwise. Good. So I just want to say, by means of introduction, how I got into this area of work, restorative justice and sexually harmful behaviour. As Myra said, I'm a forensic psychologist, have been, my professional birthday is next Tuesday, when I'm shocked to realise that I will have been doing this job for 34 years. I know I don't look old enough, but that's the truth. And for many of those years, about 20 of those 34 years, I was involved in sex offender treatment. That was initially in the prison service, where I worked at HMP Grendon. And then since 1995, I became involved in sex offender treatment in the community here in the Thames Valley, and this was an area of my practice. And one of the things that would happen when I would give talks about my work, not to international audiences like today, but to more local audiences, there would often be a question asked, which was that you've told us what you're doing for offenders and perpetrators, what we'd now call people who commit sexual offences, but what are you doing to help victims of sexual abuse? And the problem there for me was that I didn't have a very good answer, really. The best I could have come up with was, well, we're trying to stop them doing it again. We're trying to stop them to create further victims. And then often then they'd sort of drop the line of inquiry, but they might say, well, what are you doing for the people who've actually been victimized? All these resources going towards people who've offended. What are you doing to put it right for people who have been sexually abused? You know, an experience which is very often deeply traumatic. And there is an awareness of that working with the perpetrators. But I didn't have a good enough answer, I didn't think, for this question. And then what happened to me is probably about 10 years ago now, I went to a talk which was given by a woman called Angela. And Angela spoke about what basically going through the process of what we're going to talk about today. She had gone through a restorative justice process with the man who had sexually abused her when she was a child. This was a number of years later, and she had a meeting with him, which was orchestrated and carefully arranged, whereby she communicated with the man and he communicated with her, and she described how empowering and how positive that experience was for her. And one of the things that was always coming up in the treatment work that I was doing was that the key aspect of sexual abuse is that a perpetrator devises a way in which they can feel extremely powerful and in control, and often this is a way of compensating for negative feelings of powerlessness that they might have within themselves. But they can do this, unfortunately, and completely kind of unacceptably by exerting power and control over another person in the most intimate way imaginable, really, and that is in a sexual way. So people who've been sexually abused, they've had their power and control in a very intimate aspect of their life taken away from them by a perpetrator, and this can lead to very major feelings of distress and upset and powerlessness and trauma, what we'd now call trauma. So the idea that you could somehow re-empower a person who'd been sexually abused through this process, whereby they have the opportunity to I guess, interact with, you might say confront, because I do think a key thing about this area of practice that I've been involved with, it's not restorative justice exactly in the sense that the desired outcome. I do realize there's different premises for restorative justice, different desired outcomes. But it isn't really, it's not really about reconciliation or about forgiveness, really, this work. It's more, I would see it as the opportunity for the victim to find a voice and to be re-empowered from the situation where they were very, very significantly disempowered. And this, to me, the talk that I heard Angela give was the best talk I'd ever heard in my entire career. And it wasn't until I then heard another person give a talk, which was in Bradford 3 years ago. That was a woman called Jill. I'm still in touch with Angela and Jill, by the way. And I've worked with them because I'm very interested to find out more about their experience. And Jill gave a very similar talk at an event in Bradford, which was organised by an organisation called Restorative Solutions that I'm involved with. And then Jill's talk, where Jill spoke about her restorative experience with a man who had raped her, wearing a balaclava in her bedroom. You know, she gave this incredibly powerful speech about the restorative experience of going through the conference with him. So that became the first equal best talk I'd ever heard in my career as well, Jill and Angela's talks. And this is, to my mind, why this area of practice is so important, because it gives this opportunity to victims, which I don't believe is really quite available in any other context. Now, I know we haven't got a representative from victims services or counselling services here, and they may have a different view from me. And we haven't really got time today to go into all the different kind of options of work that victims can undertake to try and improve their psychological well-being. But in my opinion, this one that we're talking about today is extremely powerful. And I suppose you can evaluate it. Diana's going to talk later on about her own work of evaluation. But one of the good things about evaluating this work, from my point of view, is you really just have to ask a victim if they feel better at the end of the process. And if they say yes, then it's been effective. You see, one of the huge challenges tomorrow afternoon, funny enough, I'm giving another talk on the HMPPS, that's Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service Insights banner. That's all about how to evaluate treatment programs for people who commit sexual offences. It's very challenging because you have to wait very long periods of time before people haven't re-offended to really say that the treatment's effective. But this kind of intervention, you know, if you were doing a very thorough piece of work like Diana has, I suppose you'd say to the victim, do you feel better now? Then you might ask them in 6 months, do you still feel better? You might ask them in 18 months, you know, you'd be monitoring their well-being. I'm very aware that I'm probably already run out of time, but I did want to say at this thing as the sort of preamble of why this work is so important. It's also very important, I think, from the point of view of the perpetrator. But this is work that in fact, Jill, who I mentioned earlier, Jill is undertaking her own doctorate research on the impact of this RJ and sexually harmful behaviour on the perpetrator themselves, because many of the people who committed sexual offences that I've worked with were genuinely remorseful about what they'd done. Not all of them, but some of them definitely were. And they did want to apologise to their victim for what they'd done, the person they'd victimised. And they were very keen to do that. And this is a way in which that can happen. So it seems that this is a reason we really should pursue this work. How am I doing, Mara? Have I still got 5 minutes, hopefully?
Nope, that's perfect. Andrew, you've actually hit upon the 10-minute slot now, but you've said the issues will emerge in the 2 stories that you and Helen are going to share. So with that introduction around power, disempowerment, empowerment, that gives us a kind of focus. But you can tease out some of the issues that you think need to be pulled out under that when we turn now to Helen and you've got 2 case studies, which you're going to share over the next half hour. Do you want to introduce Helen and let's hear the first story?
Thank you. And thank you, Andrew. And Andrew, do come in at any time if you want to. So I'm Helen Lainey. I'm one of the senior practitioners in Thames Valley Restorative Justice Service. I've been doing this for 20 years. So I'm one of the original team when Thames Valley Restorative Justice was set up. For the first 14 or so years, we took referrals from offenders and not from victims, and sexual offences were excluded. And then we were able to start taking referrals from victims. I'm sorry about the dog barking in the background. And now more than half of our cases are cases of sexual violence. Now, when I started, I was not an expert in sexual violence or sexual offending or anything like that. And I felt that I needed to get some specialist input into the work, and my colleagues agreed as well. And that's where we dragged Andrew in as somebody who we felt that could be really useful. And I think one of the points I really want to get across today is that as a facilitator, you are probably not an expert on sexual violence, on mental health, on domestic violence, on bereavement, on all the other issues that we deal with. So we do call on other people as and when. So we have regular meetings with Andrew and his input into helping us to understand sex offenders and sexual violence has been invaluable. So 2 cases that I want to talk about. Both of these cases are ones that Diana included in her research. And she's going to talk about what the victims hoped to achieve in restorative justice and what their outcomes were. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'll leave that to Diana. So I'm going to concentrate on some of the practical issues that came up. And the issues in these cases are by no means uncommon. They're ones which come up in a lot of cases. I have, just because of the constraints of time today and for anonymity, I'm not going to talk about much of the detail of these cases. I'm sure we all understand why. So, but I hope that they still make sense despite that. So the first case was, we'll call her Casey. Casey was a young woman who had been sexually abused as a child by a family friend. She hadn't reported it at the time, but when she was sort of late teens, early 20s, she heard that this particular man had abused someone else. So that prompted her to go to the police. He was charged. There were 2 trial dates set. He said that he was too ill to attend. But eventually there was a trial. He changed his plea to guilty the day before the trial, and he was then given a custodial sentence of several years. So Casey was quite relieved about that, but then realized, as is very common, that her questions, the questions that were important for her, had not been answered by the court process. And this is something that we get with victims who come to us time and time again, that a prosecution, the sentencing is fine, but it's often not what really enables a victim to move on. So I went to see her, and what she wanted to know was why he had done it. Now, I know from experience and from talking to Andrew, you ask the average sex offender why they did it, and the answer you're likely to get is, I don't know, which is not very helpful for a victim. I felt that it was important that we really sort of explore, Casey and I, what actually it was that was tied up in that question of why did you do it, and tease it apart. That was quite a difficult process for her, because she was having to address her trauma a bit more deeply than was comfortable. But we did it, and so she came up with a number of questions and statements. So she wanted to hear him take responsibility. She wanted, if possible, to witness true remorse from him, and obviously she needed to meet him face to face to do that. She wanted to ask why her in particular. Did he realize that what he was doing was wrong? And if he did, why did he continue? Did she do something wrong? Again, that's quite a common question that victims come up with. Does he blame her for being sent to prison? Again, quite a common question. She wanted to tell him the impact that it had on her, which were considerable. She wanted to show him that he no longer had any power over her. And she wanted to forgive him as well. And I asked her more about what that forgiveness meant to her. Was it for her benefit or was it for his benefit? And she said very clearly that it was for her benefit, because that would be a way of her being able to leave it behind and move on. So I felt then that we had some questions there that were possibly more able for this man to answer than just a straight "why did you do it" question. So I went off to the prison to see him. He was very happy to see me. He was pleased that he was contacted. He was very remorseful. He said he was unable to explain why he did it, which is not a surprise. And he was very willing to meet with her. On the way back to the gate in the prison, his prison officer told me about his only other previous experience of restorative justice, and he did let it be known to me that he had not been impressed with it, and he thought it was a complete waste of time. So I thought, this isn't a very good start. He also then said that he didn't know whether the prisoner was emotionally up to a meeting with Casey. So again, another question that was coming up in my mind was, is this officer really on board with this process, or could this be a stumbling block? A week later, having had this commitment from this man that he would meet Casey, I got a message to say that he changed his mind. So I went back to see him. He said, oh, well, all the other prisoners have told me that if I do restorative justice, I'll end up in court. So I had to say, no, that's not the case. Oh, that's all right then, he said. So he then said that he would meet her. I went back to see Casey. That was fine. We talked about strategies for her to cope with the emotions in the meeting and all the rest of it, doing all the usual sort of prep stuff with her. And then 2 weeks later, the offender pulled out again, saying that his health was suffering because of the anxiety to it.
Helen, I wonder if I could, sorry, I don't mean to stop you in full flow, but you're raising some of our the challenging issues. You're touching on them in real life, and I'm very pleased you are. And indeed, you've hit our number one problem, which is buy-in from staff working in the criminal justice field. And you've articulated that very well. That many people working in criminal justice, be they probation officers, prison officers, even forensic psychologists, dare I say it, maybe don't understand the wider principles of RJ, and they're certainly very cautious about them in cases of sexual harm, because they may make assumptions. One of the problems also is that they may make assumptions about how a victim feels, which are not based on any actual information. You know, that people say, well, I'm sure the victim doesn't want to do that. And one of the key things that's come through our discussions, has it not, is that the victim will tell you what they want. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The victim has already been deprived of power and control in their life in the most intimate and destructive way. So the idea that you're going to continue to not empower them by making decisions based on not even meeting them seems very wrong. And this is a major challenge in our area of work. And then you also you touched on the next one, which is the fragility of the process of RJ, and the fact that in this case, although my understanding is it's relatively rare, but in the case you're describing, the man withdrew from the process because of information he'd heard that may have not been accurate. So the fragility of that, we're working towards this end, which either side could pull out of at any time, which is inherently challenging as well. Please go on, but I wanted to make those points because they're so relevant to what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a conversation just a couple of weeks ago with somebody in a prison who said, but it's not in the best interest of the victim to get a letter from the offender.
Well, if we
was
had
a specific letter that she had asked for, and I said, how do you know that it's not in her best interest? You've never spoken to her, you've never met her. So we do come up against this quite often. So anyway, I went back to to Casey. She felt that he was just using his ill health as an excuse, as he had twice to delay the trial. So, sorry, excuse me. She then asked if he would write to her and answer her questions in a letter. So I said, yeah, I'll see if he's willing to do that. So I went back to see him, took her questions. He was very happy to see me again. And he said, yes, I'm very happy to do that. So we left it that he would write the letter. Lo and behold, a week later, get a message from the prison officer, he's not going to do it. That was very disappointing. So I went back to Casey and told her, and she said, well, that doesn't surprise me, actually, you know, given him lots of opportunities here, and he's not taking them. So she then asked if she could write to him. I said I would be happy to take a letter from her. I had no guarantee that he would accept it or read it, but you know, we could try. So that's what we did. She wrote in the circumstances was a lovely letter. You know, she started off by thanking him for pleading guilty, because that saved her all the having to go through a trial. It was quite a heartfelt letter. She said she didn't blame him, she just wanted some answers. So there was nothing threatening in this letter at all. When I saw him again, he was very willing to see me, and I had the letter in me, but I had it with the rest of my papers. And I said, I have got this letter. Do you want it? So I very much didn't try to force it on him, but he willingly said that he wanted to see her letter. And he was very visibly moved by it, and said that when he moved prisons to another prison where he would be more settled, he would be happy to meet her then. So I took that with a big pinch of salt. But I did say, you know, what can I take back to Casey? And he said, you know, you can tell her how I feel and how I've responded to the letter. So I was able to do that. But lo and behold, when he did move, we never did get the meeting because he wouldn't agree. So that was that case then closed, and I felt it was quite frustrating, and I wondered, you know, how useful the whole process had been for Casey. I'll let Diana talk about that, because Diana actually met her, I think, twice, Diana, so she'll talk about that. But for me, the learning points from this case was, as Andrew said, the influence of other people on the offender. So in this case, prisons, perhaps prison officer, there are very subtle ways, of course, in which you can make somebody think this isn't a very good idea. And I had no evidence that that's what this prison officer was doing, but it wouldn't have been at all surprising to me if he was saying, well, this is all a bit stressful for you. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Would you like me to write to Helen and tell her that, it's, I suspect there was some of that going on. And when you're not working in the prison, of course, it's really difficult to do anything about that. Second learning point was breaking down this question of which is the very common question, why did you do it? And lots of men who have committed sexual offences are not able or are not willing to articulate why they've done it. And we've had lots of discussions with Andrew about that. So breaking it down into more manageable questions is good. But it might be that you have to wait quite a long time until somebody's done some treatment programs in prison before they have a real understanding. And in fact, I saw somebody last week, who we did a conference with, must be 3 years ago now. And he was not able then to say why he thought it was acceptable to rape his own daughter. And I saw him last week, and he's done several programs, and he was able to talk with much greater insight into his motivation and his behaviour. So now arranging the second meeting. That does mean that sometimes the victim has to wait 2, 3, 4 or more years, which is difficult.
Can I just come in again, Helen, please? Yeah. Because I think, you pitched an interesting case here, because as you said, in some ways the outcome was disappointing, but nonetheless, the way in which you allowed the victim, Katie, to have a voice, to ask a number of questions, and we keep hearing do we not, as you rightly say, why did they do it? And in fact, really, I think we've often discussed that the victim wants to know more than just that, and the wider questions beneath the why question, which you just articulated, and you gave an opportunity that I don't think she would have had elsewhere by any other service to articulate that process. If she'd gone to see a counsellor, they might have focused on her own feelings. But the very fact that you were simply in the conduit between the perpetrator and the victim put you in quite a unique and important position. I think it empowers your role that you're doing that. Whereas if Katie had just gone to see a counsellor, whatever the counsellor would say, however helpful it might be, the counsellor doesn't know the perpetrator and isn't present in the context of their unfortunate victim-perpetrator relationship. So what you're saying is still very empowering, I think, of the victim. And we can't get away from the distressing finding that we're often talking about in our work about, well, I'll call it out for what it is, sort of hostility to victims, believe it or not, and I might get in trouble for saying this, so but from a criminal justice system which purports to be about protecting and preventing victims. Victims are often actively denied a voice, even when they might be allowed one, and that really does not seem fair or right. And if that's, that's a key message, I think, from our, and that's, I think, why you and your excellent colleagues have continued this work, because it is addressing that continual challenge.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you,
I just wanted to say that.
No, that's fantastic. Actually, it's really lovely to listen to you both, because I think we're getting an example of what you mentioned at the beginning, Helen, when you're dealing with situations, drawing on Andrew's help to reflect is a helpful method to do your work. You've given us a kind of window into a case study of how you would do normally. We need to move to the next case study, if you will, Helen.
Yes, certainly. So the next one is Faye. Faye was abused for about 6 years by her older brother when they were children. Well, but she was 8, I think. She told her mother when she was 14. Mother said, I'll talk to him, it won't happen again, and we're going to forget about this, which was not a very helpful response for Faye. Faye then went off the rails. I think she's be happy to describe it at that. Became a troublesome teenager, and grew up being regarded as the black sheep of the family, whereas brother was the golden boy, and that was quite difficult for her. She then, at a family do when they were both in their 30s, he said to her one day quietly, "I'm sorry for what happened when we were little." That's all he said, but that was enough for her to realise that actually she needed a bit more than this, and she referred herself to us. She'd never reported it to the police, and she didn't want to, but she hadn't ruled it out. She thought that restorative justice would be a better way of her getting what she needed rather than going to the police. But if he didn't engage, then that was in her mind that she would. So my first issue with this was, how do I engage the brother? I didn't want to go to him and say, look, talk to me or else she's going to go to the police, because that would have been, from my point of view, completely unethical to make that sort of threat. But on the other hand, I felt that he had the right to know that whether he made a decision not to engage with RJ, what the consequence of that might be. So that was very much sort of balancing act there. We also, Faye said that he's got an anger problem. He's got a very quick temper. So we did talk about whether she would be safe once he knew, once I'd approached him. And she then came up with an escape plan from her house out through her back garden, so she couldn't be seen from the front. And she had identified 2 neighbours who both knew what the situation was that she could go to for refuge. So we got that sorted. The other problem with engaging the brother, because it hadn't been reported to the police, was this whole question of confidentiality. If he admitted to me that he had committed very serious offences of rape against a minor, what do I do with that information? Am I under a necessity to report that to the police? That would be going against the victim's wishes. Obviously, if there was a new admission, so if he'd said to me, oh yes, and by the way, I've been abusing my neighbour's children as well, then that I obviously would have to take that forward. But so I had lots of discussions with this, with my line manager, with my colleagues, about this problem. What do I do with this information if he does admit? And we decided, and you may or may not agree with me, we decided the victim is not a vulnerable adult. She was perfectly capable of going to the police herself if she wanted to. There was no evidence that there was anybody else at risk. So we looked at it from a safeguarding point of view as well. She was not at risk. There were no other children in the family because the children were all grown up and adults. Other family members knew what had happened, so they were then able to protect anyone who needed protecting. And so we felt that I would not need to report any admission that he made to me.
Helen, can I come in there, please? Because you're illustrating the real complexity of your work, having to consider those issues that would not be considered. Most people who work in criminal justice work with people who've been convicted in a court of law, and they are legally, identified as an offender. So, I think this is an extremely important aspect. And I also wanted to pick up the thing you mentioned earlier, because where I think some of our most interesting discussions have gone. You know, it's one thing to say that a perpetrator who has been convicted, who has undergone a treatment program and who is genuinely remorseful, wishes to apologize to the victim, and we sometimes facilitate that, don't we, in restorative justice. But you're here talking about a case when kind of none of that is true, and indeed you may be talking about a case where the perpetrator is not convicted, but not remorseful, maybe even maintains hostile views, but still we keep coming back to the very important lesson of our work and of today. It's what the victim's voice is what's important, because I think if you say we will only do this if the offender is remorseful and treated, you are still placing this within the context of the offender. The offender should be the one who demonstrates the treatment progress, is remorseful. It still leaves the victim out. Well, what we're saying, I mean, and I think your case here is a very good example. And I've spoken with Restorative Solutions colleagues about cases where, you know, if the victim wants to meet with the perpetrator, then that should be our guiding principle. And if it means that you have to have 2 prison officers either side of the man in case he kicks off, and that would be a very extreme example, but we might say, well, so be it, because that's what the victim wants, and this is about empowering the victim and giving them a voice that they have hitherto been denied. So I think that's a really important point on what you were saying. Sorry, I'll let you carry on now.
That's okay. That's okay. So we also talked about the other family members. So Faye didn't have a good relationship with her mother, and she was very well prepared for a very negative reaction from her mother. So that was something else that she had to consider. So I did make contact with the brother. He expressed very deep shame and remorse. He talked about abuse of various forms that he had experienced as a child. He was quite troubled he was wondering whether he had committed these offences because he was born that way, or whether it was a result of his own experiences. So he was very happy to meet with Faye. They both had quite different memories about what had happened then. So I did a lot of going backwards and forwards between them, and we agreed that in the meeting that we would not talk about specific details about what happened. And again, this is something that happens quite often with cases of sexual violence, where the victim does not want the offender to say, I did X, Y, and Z to you. And sometimes, you know, we don't want offenders to be saying that in case it excites all sorts of memories for them. We agreed beforehand on a format of the meeting that would be an acknowledgement that he had committed sexual abuses against her and acknowledged the harm. So that was fine. We adapted the script accordingly. I have to say, we had the meeting, we had one of the best venues I've ever used. It was quiet, it was calm, it was comfortable, and it can make such a difference to have the right room that you're in, the right venue. The meeting lasted 3.5 hours. I think it's probably the longest one I've ever done. It was quite intense. Well, it was very intense. There was a lot of apologies and remorse from the brother. They talked about wider family issues, other family members. They agreed to support each other. Faye said what she really wants is an older brother that she can look up to, that she can go to, you know, when the car breaks down or whatever. She wants that sort of relationship, an older brother relationship. That was quite a turning point for him, because he thought that she wouldn't want anything more to do with him. So that was significant. And then he told her that he thought that she had been a fantastic mother, and that just was a jaw-dropping moment for her, that he thought that. Again, really, really significant for her. So the learning points for this case was this whole question of limitations on confidentiality where a case that hasn't been reported, and balancing that with not taking control away from the victim, which can be a bit tricky. Second learning point was cases that involve family members who have a whole history of relationships behind them, of relationships with other family members. I, as a facilitator, I'm scratching the surface. I have no idea of most of what they know between them. And that puts, I think, a very different dynamic on the meeting. They're very different meetings than the meetings where it's a stranger.
And indeed, Helen, if I could just come in, because that's another of our challenges, as you said, where, you know, where the kind of the wider impact of the conference in a family context, or, you know, that it can be even the emotional impact. Incidentally, what you're describing here does sound like it did have some genuine, sort of very constructive, restorative outcomes on both sides, which I should say we would always hope would be the case. You know, I think within the discussions we've had, we've acknowledged the kind of these kind of wide parameters of all the areas we're working in, but we would still hope it was as constructive and restorative on both sides. I didn't want to give the impression of what I said earlier, that this is, you know, solely about the victim at all costs. Clearly their voice is very important, as you've said. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
And that's great. That's great.
And I think one last point, Myra,
Okay. Yeah.
and I think in both of these cases, I did need to be mindful of a duty of care to the person who committed the offence. And sometimes that is really difficult to get to say that to a victim. You have to be quite careful about how you say it. But as an impartial facilitator, I do have that duty of care, and I do need to make sure that I'm not delivering a process that is great for the victims, but that does actually significantly harm another party. So yeah, that was my last learning point. So yeah, back over to you, Myra.
Thank you, Helen and Andrew, for those two discussions. We're going to stay with those, but we're going to move to Diana, who's going to pick up some of the issues, especially around the victims. And then I want to say to everybody, when Diana's presentation is finished, we will still have 25 minutes for discussion. And there are quite a lot of issues arising in the chat box, which perhaps Helen and Andrew can have an eye on as well, because some of the things will need picking up. But I think some of those will already be picked up by Diana. So it's over to you, Diana.
Okay, can you see me, and can you see, should I start the slideshow? At the moment you can see everything, can you?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, I'll just go with that then. So yes, you've already been told who I am, and actually I'll say some more detail about my research as I go. So I'll just straight in with a bit of background in terms of research, because we have evidence that restorative justice at some of the time and under some conditions benefits victims. And so the conversation with that started, you know, actually it started very formally. People started just doing restorative justice, then different bits of evidence were gathered in all different forms, some studies better than others, and eventually we have even randomized trials. So really isolating the effects of the restorative justice, so we can exclude the fact that it's just time passing or some other process. There are studies showing that victims are satisfied, that their trauma levels decrease, and that their anger and anxiety can decrease. But that's for restorative justice generally. And for restorative justice with sexual offences, I would say that we're just sort of a step behind, really. So for a long time, nobody was doing it. It was considered outside the bounds of what RJ should be doing. Practice has begun. I mean, as any of you who were there with Estelle Zinstag at the last Mint House talk saw, it's happening, and there is slowly increasing amount of evidence that it is beneficial to all parties, but I'm going to focus on the victim side just because that's what my research was looking at. So I should also say the effects on the offender and in the community at large are also really important, but my research is all on the victim's experience. So I've put a few studies there, which are kind of these bits and pieces of evidence that it is probably beneficial for at least some victims at least of the time, but we definitely don't have a randomized control study, and yeah, there's a sort of bit of a lack of evidence at the moment. With my research, what I wanted to do was, I didn't have the ability to do a randomized control study, and there may not ever be one, in fact, because of the ethics of kind of denying people who want to participate the opportunity to participate. So another way of approaching this is looking at, okay, so if let's say that there are some benefits, as Andrew said, in a way you could just ask people, do you feel better? Yes, I do. Great. What's not to like? But what's really important is to look at how victims benefit. So what is actually changing? And the reasons we want to do that are so that we can identify whether it is indeed the restorative justice that is creating those effects, because victims can tell us themselves, oh, well, you know, when the offender said such and such, this shifted for me, this changed. And then we know it wasn't just the passing of time or some other intervention. And the other reason we want to know how is to improve practice. So victims experiencing victims having the choice of going into restorative justice don't to be just stepping into this black box of, oh, we think it will make you feel better, so give it a try. They want to make an informed decision about what may happen and how that might help to be able to decide to participate or not. And then it's about managing expectations. It's then when there are outcomes, having the ability to kind of interpret them in a way that's most beneficial for everyone involved. And of course, then designing and evaluating future RJ interventions. So when I started, in fact, if anyone was at the Mint House event that I spoke at in 2017, a long time ago, you may recognize this slide because I was collecting the theories of how it might work for victims. And actually, there's no shortage of theories. There's quite a lot of them, but there's very little evidence. So there are some few really good studies looking in depth at what changes and how, but they're quite far and few between. So I started research in 2015 with Thames Valley Partnership agreed to collaborate, and the wonderful Helen and her colleagues asked victims who they were working with if they would be willing to be interviewed by me both before and after the restorative justice process. So that's the main study which informs these findings that I'll tell you about in more depth. But just to also say, there's some additional parts that informs my thinking, which is some quantitative analysis of the British Crime Survey, where victims are asked about whether they would like to participate in RJ or would have wanted to if they'd been given the opportunity, and an online survey. So I should also say I didn't interview all of my participants before and after because of the practical problems, which I'm sure any of you involved in this kind of research know. But I did interview both Faye and Casey, who those are not their real names, by the way, both before and after. So I will get to them. I know some of you mentioned what happened. I identified both from existing literature, so these things are not brand new, but from the existing research and from the study, 5 main categories of things that were changing for victims. So of course there could be thousands of these. You know, almost every individual's experience is different, and you could just say, well, there's no way of categorizing them because they're so different from one another. But there were these 5 themes that kept cropping up over and over again. Actually, in RJ with, so of my 40 participants, I should say half of them were sexual offences and half of them were other types of offences. And these were common across the board, but some of them were particularly important for victims of sexual offences, which I'll point out as we go. So I'll talk about them each in a little bit more depth. So procedural justice, which we've alluded to already, victims having a say over what happens to them, being respected, feeling that they have a sense of control, just getting basic information about the process. So regardless of the outcomes, everybody wants the process to be fair. And this is particularly important for victims who've often come through a criminal justice system where they don't feel that's been the case at all. They haven't been listened to, they haven't been even part of the process, let alone having a choice in it. And so lots of the people who I interviewed wanted RJ for this reason. They actually often because they didn't get it in the criminal justice system, they thought, well, maybe this is a place where I can finally have some control over what happened to me, as kind of Andrew and Helen have already talked about. And as an example, I'm sorry, I'm actually just going to close my window because someone started drilling out there. So as an example, this is what Faye said. Again, actually, we'll come in more depth to all the other outcomes for her, but one of the things was extremely important. When you go through the criminal justice system, your voice isn't heard. That's why she didn't want to go to the police. At least with the restorative justice, then yes, you could, your voice is heard. So she'd felt listened to by Helen, she'd felt listened to by the offender, and she'd felt given more confidence to then talk to others. Just as another example, Terry, none of these are their real names, by the way, was abused by her father, and he was convicted, and she wanted to meet him, to which he actually agreed, but he was denying the offence still. So she had the option to meet him and decided not to. And I thought this was an important one to just bring up because this comes to interpretation, and in some cases, victims interpreted that scenario as he's not, he or she, but generally he is not cooperating. They have control over the process and I don't. I wanted to meet them, but they were denying the offence. Oh no, you know, that's bad. But in this case, she actually interpreted that as, well, I've gone forward, I've tried to do this thing, I've given him the opportunity, he is denying the offence, but I then make the final decision whether I meet him or not. So I am the one who's re-empowered. So just raise that partly because interpretation of the events is so important, and the facilitators play such a big part in helping people interpret what has happened to them. The second main sort of goal that people had, the change that they wanted to see, was in their view of the offender's punishment. Now this is, I mean, again, we've already kind of alluded to it, but it's slightly controversial in RJ circles, I think, because when RJ first started, it was often alternative to the court system. So victims were choosing between a court process and a sentence, or an RJ process. And then I think the other reason it's slightly controversial is that the RJ world has had to work quite hard to show that it's not about vigilante justice. We're not talking about getting very punitive victims into a room with their offenders and having a baseball bat and taking their revenge. Most often that's not what victims want to do anyway. And so I think what's happened is that we often then gloss over victims' very natural human desire, particularly when it's something like a serious sexual offence, to know that the offender has been punished. And interestingly, you know, the victims I interviewed, they didn't want to just know that the punishment was as harsh as it possibly could be. They wanted the feeling it was the right punishment. And so actually, they wanted to hear from the offender, this is what it's been like, this is what my day-to-day life is like in prison, let's say, or these are the courses I have to on, etc. And they wanted to hear that that punishment had made a difference. So just as an example, Hannah, who was sexually abused as a child by her mother's partner, said, I needed to see him in prison because I needed to see that I've put him there and I was the one who was able to walk out and go home. And I think, you know, it's difficult because that doesn't, again, sound very restorative by some definitions of the word restorative, but actually it allowed him to express how difficult it was for him being in prison. She didn't want to hear some of it, but he had the chance to tell her that he had been punished, and she had the chance to sort of see it with her own eyes. And for both of them, but particularly for her, that gave her a sense of satisfaction and vindication that she could not have got any other way, and probably could not even have got by the sentence much longer. You know, we often hear that, oh, maybe victims want longer and longer sentences. Perhaps they don't. Perhaps they want feedback that punishment has been administered and what it's like and what effect it's had. Something that all victims consistently said was that they wanted to stop it happening again. And again, perhaps we sort of think of this as on the minor end with victims of low end offences, young offenders, maybe they want to stop the offender from burgling somebody else's house. And that's often an explicit motivation. But for all of these victims, this was also really important. And actually, victims were sensible about it. The victims of very serious sexual offences were realistic, perhaps kind of pessimistic about whether it would have that effect, but they wanted to try. And so I had a real, some people it did. So Kathy, after she heard from the offender about his experience of going to court and the prison, she said he sounded as if he had actually learned a lesson. And I came away feeling hopeful, basically, that he wouldn't do it to someone else. But for other people, it was the idea that even if it had failed, he had tried. So actually, this is one of the things that Casey said, that it wasn't, although it has obviously completely failed, you know, she'd had no communication, really successful communication with him at all, in the sense of that would be likely to stop him doing it again. But she felt for herself, well, at least I've tried everything. And this is such a difficult one because obviously nobody should be implying to victims that they have any responsibility to stop it happening again. They absolutely don't. But a lot of victims already feel that responsibility. And so going down these channels allows them to feel that that is then out of their hands. Lots of people wanted to find out more about the crime or the offender. And again, the sort of classic version of this we often hear about is a victim who has only known the offender in a dark place at the moment of the crime, meets the offender and finds out that they're actually not a monster and that it's a bit more complicated than they thought and it's not someone they need to be afraid of. But in these cases, it was much more complicated than that. In fact, it was almost sometimes the opposite, in the sense that quite a lot of victims had somewhat of a positive view of the offender. So if they were also a father, a spouse, a child, they had some positive relationship and association with that person, but then also the knowledge that they had committed that crime. So for Sadie in particular, the crime was not committed against her. So her very positive image of her father, she couldn't kind of make sense of, knowing that he had raped her mother and sister. And so for her, the motivation was to figure him out, find out, is he completely crazy and doesn't have any emotion, or does he have emotion, he's just ill? She just wanted to know. And so her view in the end of him wasn't any more positive. In fact, it was probably more negative, but it was clearer, and she had a sense of certainty. These sort of ruminations, how could this person be who I thought he was, or how could the world be as I thought it was, made sense and came together. And I can come back to Willow actually, because something Casey said is quite similar to that. So on to the fifth main sort of category of change that victims were experiencing. It was in their view of themselves. So one of the things that people wanted to do was talk about the impact of the crime. And that's, we know that that's often happens in RJ meetings, but particularly for victims of ongoing offences which were committed in their childhood, it was very difficult to distinguish between the impact of the crime and who they were as a person. Because if these crimes have been going on for such a long time, let's say they were very afraid, and they were consistently afraid. And so telling the offender, this was the impact of your crime on me, and that's why I'm afraid. It's not because by nature I am a fearful person. It's two very different things. That was something really important, that a lot of people came out the other side with a different view of themselves. In terms of stopping blaming themselves, this is a good, in fact, I think I've got a quote from Casey in just a moment. This was really key, and I think this is maybe the answer. So how did Casey deal with it all? She said, this guy was a family friend when she was younger. To everything she remembered, aside from the abuse, a nice guy. So part of her logic in her own mind was that then she must have been bad. He wasn't necessarily the bad one, so she must have been. She must have caused it somehow. And she even said, well, intellectually, I know that's not the case, but I just feel that it's my fault somehow. And what happened when he led her through, what I think we can all agree was potentially an incredibly damaging process, it wasn't. And what actually happened was that she interpreted it as, I am the courageous one here. I'm willing to go through all of this, and he's not. So I am brave. And I used to feel bad about him being in prison, and I've just thinking, oh, is this my fault, or do I feel bad for reporting it? But here we go. I'll go to the quote. I was blaming myself to an extent. I still do, because it's not always a miraculous cure, but not as much, because he hasn't done A, B, and C to at least try and prove that he is remorseful. She said he could just spend an hour of his life, and he knows it would make a huge difference to me, and he's not willing to. So by extension, maybe I'm not the bad person, maybe he's the bad person, which maybe means the crime wasn't my fault. And that was actually quite a common reaction among people, where the offender either didn't participate at all, or denied the offence, or it was kind of negative in some way, interpreted in a certain way. The victim could still really benefit from that. I'll just say briefly about Bridget, because she had been raped by a stranger several years before, and then they found him, and she wanted to meet with him. And she just kind of showed that what changed for her in terms of seeing herself differently was being the person who was willing to be courageous and brave. So it wasn't that all the risks were managed, and think this was Helen's case, but whoever the facilitator was didn't say, I promise you it's going to be fine, because they can't, and it might not be. And Bridget herself said, it was either going to help me or set me back. I could have been crying continuously, gone back to the early stages of it happening. It could have destroyed me emotionally, I think. It's quite a big risk. I was determined to meet him. It did take a lot of bravery, and I was very proud of myself after I did it. So that's just to point out that, you know, sometimes that's why the process is so key in terms of how people see it and how it then benefits. Andrew wants to say something. Have I run out of time? How much time have I got left, Myra?
I just wanted to say, Diana, that it's kind of ironic that the victim, you know, the person being convicted of a crime against them doesn't allow them to feel that they were in the right. Do you see what I mean? Whereas the restorative process that you just described did, if you see what I mean, you know. So, and I think what you're saying, all of these things are about the victim having a voice that they seem not to attain through the general criminal justice process. And even what you're saying about the reality of punishment, because yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think sometimes the only punishment people want to hear classically is throw away the key, you know, life sentence forever. You know, we all know that's a tiny number of people, but this process it allows for a kind of humanizing and a perception of the criminal justice process that the formal procedure seems not to. I think that, you know, just wanted to make that additional point.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I will wrap up because I know I've only got probably no minutes left. But I just wanted to say this, for me, I think this is going back to how and what changes is so important, is because it is a spectrum in terms of, you know, very rarely, if ever, does the victim wish for a certain number of things and then the offender can supply all of those. In fact, I'll just go to here. You know, the offender can vary in the extent to which they're willing to listen, to how they take responsibility, how much empathy they have. And yet, as long as the victim knows in advance that that's the level they're at and that that's what they are likely to get, then they can be the ones to make the choice about whether they want to participate given X, Y, and Z from the offender. And I mean, I think that's a huge, it's a difficult road to navigate for facilitators because it's all about shuttle mediation and just preparing the victim for every possible scenario and conveying as much information as things so the victim makes this informed decision. But I think with reflective practice on all these hurdles, it's certainly demonstrated that victims can benefit enormously and in these less than ideal scenarios. You're on mute, Myra.
Beg your pardon. Thank you, Diana, very much indeed. We have 20 minutes still. It may be that Andrew and Helena would like to just jump in at this moment and complete the roundup of the case study we've been hearing. But there are lots of people raising questions in the chat room, and they should feel free to raise a hand and speak up in this time that we have left. Some of the people that have been writing in the chat room have said, is the PowerPoint available? Maybe you can let us know that, Diana, if you're willing to have that PowerPoint made available. They're also wondering whether the research has been published, and if so, where that can be acquired. We can also say that this has been recorded. So there is a possibility to access the presentation, but it may not be that the PowerPoint will be there. That will depend on Diana's decision.
So I just quickly rushed here because I was going to do a quick plug of this at the end and then I should stop. Yeah. But I'm just in the process, with input from Andrew and Helen and others from Thames Valley Partnership, actually, in creating a practitioner guide based on these principles. So it's a really thorough look at the 5 areas and then how they can be met at different levels of offender cooperation, as it were. So that literally with the designers as we speak, and it will be freely available. So if it's okay with you, Myra, I'm happy to then share that, and that can be passed around to a list.
Superb, superb. And that will be published by Thames Valley, yeah?
Sorry, say that again.
Is that published by Thames Valley?
Well, it's actually published through Oxford, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the moment, but in cooperation with Thames Valley Partnership, yeah.
Perfect. So that answers some of the practical questions. Who would like to enter into the discussion now?
Could I just come on to a couple of these things in the chat room?
Please, Helen.
From Ava, did you have any difficulties when Casey asked the letter to be given to the offender? In this case, I didn't, but I do know that it is a problem sometimes in prisons. Some prisons are, and prison officers are very gatekeeperish about it. So it comes back to what Andrew was saying right at the beginning about prisons being very risk-averse places, and they don't want to do anything that's going to upset the apple cart. So I don't think we've got the answer to that. Prisons are getting better at recognising that restorative justice has a very valuable role to play in their management of their offenders, but I don't think we're there yet by any means. The one from Karen Holgate, I put this on my list of things to talk about, and then I scrubbed it because actually it's very complicated. Could I be called to give evidence? The answer to that is I don't know. And when I was doing this case, I did actually bring this up with my line manager. I think we even went to the Restorative Justice Council. As far as I'm aware, and some of you might know otherwise, as far as I'm aware, I don't think this has ever been tested in court as to whether anything said in an RJ conference is admissible as evidence. It would be very interesting. If any of you know the answer to that, I would be very interested to hear from you. It's a tricky one.
Could I just come in there, Myra, just to make a general point, really, partly inspired by my desire to keep my job, because I do work. This subject that we're talking about, RJ and sexually harmful behaviour, is currently actively under review by HMPPS. Indeed, the person who is lead for sex offender strategy, a man called Mark Farmer, and Mark's been very responsive to the issue, and so I do want to make that clear that you know these are complicated areas, and I would also want to say, from the point of view of someone who once worked in a prison, you know, you are going to have an eye, a significant eye, on the well-being of the people in your care. You know, a governor of a prison will say, my job is to make sure people don't escape and also don't, for example, take their own lives or harm themselves. And that will be a priority for. So I can see, I do want to give the other side of the story, as it were, from the prison service perspective, and also to acknowledge that the issues that we've been discussing today, I've personally been able to feed them into a review. So I think that's a positive. I wouldn't want to give the impression that we're, you know, in an adversarial situation, but it is certainly the challenges, and I think I think all of the issues that I'd hoped to raise have been, which is great, by Diana. There's a couple of others that I might mention. Oh yeah, one of them is that we're in a slightly strange situation. I don't know if this has changed now, Helen, that if a perpetrator did want to approach the victim to apologize, that was in itself an issue for, and I think still is. Am I right, Helen? I mean, you know, because the issue is victim initiated. The victim can say, I want to meet the offender, but we couldn't have it the other way around, even when the offender did want that. And that was especially in this area of sexually harmful behavior, where they could do it in, if it was a non-sexual offense. So there was a sort of conundrum. Do you want to comment on that, Helen? Because is that still the case? Because I know it was for a while.
It's certainly the case when we were talking to one of the prisons locally, where they had a number of men there who did want to engage in RJ, and there was quite a lot of resistance from some members of the staff, not all, but some, and that just put the kibosh on it completely, which was really, really disappointing. I think it's still a hurdle that we have to get over, that it wouldn't be in any way harmful to the victim to be told that something got forward for restorative justice. And actually, I think, and I remember, Andrew, you said that when you were talking to Angela once, she made the point that nobody had asked her if her perpetrator wanted to apologize to her. And that, you know, that was it needed her to ask for it, whereas, you know, she would have welcomed.
I think there were two reasons for this. I think it's been a sort of taboo subject. Firstly, there was this possibly a rather erroneous assumption that the offender would simply want to re-victimize the victim, and that they couldn't possibly be genuine in their remorse. And that's I think not the case, because they may be genuinely remorseful. But if not, there was the other side of the coin that we mentioned earlier, that this will upset the apple cart, it will upset the offender, you know, they'll self-harm, or it will cause problems for us further down the line. I think what's positive is that the taboo should be passed, and that you know, there should be this kind of communication possible without making assumptions. I think this is a key thing about our discussions, is it not? The number of assumptions that get made that seem to guide people's practice, which are sort of erroneous, you know, but they're sometimes there. But although we are talking, when we're talking about the law, the legal system, the judiciary, the prison system, we are talking about, you know, behemoth institutions that have run the way they run for many years, you know.
I just want to add into that discussion about who's allowed to initiate the discussion. In my contacts with another regional body, with Sussex Pathways, I do recall that with some prisons, the relationship of the team into the prison itself was such that there was a two-way communication going on. So it's obviously quite contextual in terms of how different prisons are run. Obviously, the hopeful is that it can become more two-way. Can I ask a question about power? Andrew, you started by this question of disempowerment and empowerment, and a lot of discussion has been about how that plays out with victim and offender. I want to ask a question of you about the power of the facilitator. Have you had the experience where a facilitator has come to a point where they think this is going to do no harm, or this is going to do more harm than good, and so they recommend not to proceed? That's taking power, but doing so because they think it will do more harm. For example, if a victim actually clearly is not quite getting this and just wants to give the offender a real rollicking, that's kind of not within the frame. On the other hand, that's their right, is it? Where does the facilitator's power begin and end?
Well, I think it would be better if Helen probably answers that, Mara, as a facilitator, which I'm not, although it is a discussion that we have had, I think, and I would make the point, this is also terribly important, that in Helen's colleagues and in the process of facilitating this work is extremely delicate and extremely requires very high levels of professionalism. And one thing we would never promote is that, RJ in this sensitive area could be undertaken by easily or by people who weren't properly qualified or very, very attentive to the process, because just the opposite is true. But Helen, what do you think about? Of course, it is true that you do have a lot of power in that role. You're brokering these very important emotional processes.
Yeah, and risk assessment is fundamental to the work that we do. So we will always identify any risks that we feel are present. But we very much take the view that so if we've identified a risk, how are we going to mitigate that risk in order to allow the process to continue safely? So in the case of a victim who is just out for revenge, I would approach that by really having sort of quite detailed discussions with the victim about how they feel, how they might feel if they were able to take some sort of revenge. If they go in there, I mean, a common one, for instance, is a victim who say, yes, I'll go and I'm just going to shout at him and tell him what for. So I just ask the question, how might he react? And they usually say, well, he'll probably walk out the room. Okay, is that what you want? Is that going to have your voice heard? So it's very much asking all those questions, which one of my colleagues always says that they're Socratic questions. I'm not quite sure what Socrates got to do with it anyway, but it's about understanding where the victim's coming from, what they want, and how they're going to get there. But obviously, at the end of the day, if I felt that it was too risky, then yes, I'm within my rights as a facilitator to say I'm not prepared to go ahead with this. I've had two instances where I've pulled the plug. One was when I went to see the offender, and he said, yeah, the only mistake I made, so he was in prison for attempted murder. The only mistake I made was I didn't do the job properly. When I get out, I'm going to make sure I do. That got passed to the local constabulary. And the other one was someone who I felt was extremely manipulative and probably quite dangerous individual. And I just felt that we shouldn't be going ahead with him. But in 20 years, just two cases that I felt that I couldn't go ahead with, I think is not bad. So it is very much about mitigating the risks. But yeah, I mean, in a meet, I am the one who is responsible for making sure that everybody's safe, and I have to take that on board.
Okay, we have Leslie wants to come in on that. Leslie, you're muted. Yeah, still muted, unfortunately. I can try and unmute you.
On it.
Okay, good.
I wanted to say just very quickly, this has been brilliant. And I'm just taking up the point about specialist training needed for people to deal with sex abuse. I think it's a very, very specific. I worked for some years, and I don't want to go into the details of that, but as a psychotherapist with people who had been institutionally sexually abused. And of course, they never, ever had the chance to meet with their abuser, because by the time it was being looked into, they were all dead. No, it was church related.
Mm.
And that thing of how their lives and the lives of their children had been really badly affected by what had happened to them. So you're talking about why somebody who has been in prison for sexual abuse, I think it's amazing how little work is done with the abusers, even in the prisons which are dealing specifically with sexual harm. Sorry, I could go on. So I think I'm going to stop there. But really, it was to say that I think this is the first training that we've done. And there's several of us here, and we've been with Restorative together for about 4 or 5 years, I reckon. And I think there was one weekend course which 4 people went on.
Okay. Thank you, Leslie. That's really helpful. And
can I just say the question is, so do you offer yourselves for training? You know, in a like this?
Thames Valley Restorative Justice Service has a training arm, which I'm one of the trainers, and Colette, who is somewhere in here, she's also another trainer. I know, Andrew, you've done lots of training, haven't you, as well? So yes, the answer to that is
I see my good friend Vince Mercer's on the line and he has his hand up, but Vince and I are involved in a 3-day training course that we've been running for the last 8 years, I think, Vince, in venues all around the country with a man called Tony Walker from Restorative Solutions. Always a very, very interesting event. And I didn't come on here to make an advert or sell my wares. But now you ask, that I do. I mean, perhaps I can send details of that, Leslie, if you want, or put you in touch with the organizer. It's usually quite well received, and it's very interesting for me to be involved in that, you know.
I think one of the issues is
okay, that's great. I think, given we are now over time, I want to give the last word to Vince, because he is going to run the next session on the 6th of October, and it will be explicitly on a training offer. Amongst the many, as you can see, there are a number evolving, all of which I'm sure are going to be complementary. But Vince, the last word for you.
Yeah, well, I just want to join in and again say thanks to all of the participants for paying attention and being party to this, but also for the presenters as well. What I'll be doing in the follow-up event on the 6th of October will be looking specifically around the AIM project's experience of working with young people and children who sexually harm. That might seem like a niche area, but approximately 1/3 of all convictions for sexual offences against children are committed by other children and young people. So that's a substantial proportion of the work, if you like. And the AIM project is probably, I don't want to big it up too much, but is probably the UK's leading charity that works in this field and has been working in the field of harmful sexual behaviour and restorative practice since around 2001. So we've got an awful lot of experience. I'm going to be sharing some of that experience with you, being critical of some of it. There were things we learned and things we would do differently, and talking about the practice issues that arise from that. I mean, following on from today, very much linked into what Helen's been talking about, looking at it from a restorative practitioner's point of view, what we need to do as restorative practitioners to offer safe processes, to offer processes which are accountable, that are trauma-informed, that meet standards, and also, this has to be said as well, processes which will win the support and the motivation to do that from other professionals. There's a big battle there for restorative justice about winning professional confidence with other professionals to gain access, if you like, to potential referrals and potential cases. So I'm going to be talking about that from a youth and a child's perspective. It will be echoing an awful lot of what's been shared today, again, particularly from Diana's research material, which Mainly it's towards adult victims, but there'll be some interesting resonances on the 6th of October with children and young people around that piece of research. So I'll welcome you to join me then. There will be a follow-up training event that we are launching, or we're running in December, that will be linked to, which I'll talk a bit more about on the 6th of October. Is that enough, Myra?
That's fantastic. And just to say that on the 6th of October, it will be at 5 o'clock, from 5 to 6:30. It would be great to see everybody again, but I want to say a huge thank you now to Andrew and to Helen and to Diana. A rich presentation, and you dovetailed into each other's contributions in a really magic way. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you everybody for joining. Cheers, till the next time.